Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I am Isaac Solomon, Vice President of Operations of the Caribbean Development Bank. On behalf of the President, Dr. Hyginus Leon, and staff of the Caribbean Development Bank, a warm welcome to our seminar on climate action in the post-COVID-19 environment. Thank you for joining us. This event is the latest in a series of activities being held to mark the 51st annual meeting of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank. As we take stock of the main development challenges in our region, the opportunity that we must seize, and what CDB and its member countries must do to respond, there is growing consensus that the future and well-being of our region is intricately tied to how we and the international community respond to climate change. It is widely considered to be the major threat of the 21st century. We are now at a critical juncture in the fight against this hazard. To reach net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050, the target we should be working toward, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, countries all over the world must make significant progress this decade. When responding to climate change, we must think in terms of pathways. If we make the right policy and investment decisions in the short run, we can ensure our societies and economies are equipped to identify, assess, and respond to climate change-related risks and opportunities continuously and collectively. This will help protect against short-term losses and damage, and thereby ensure we have the resources and capacity needed to continue investing in adaptation in the next year, the next decade, and thereafter. It is imperative that all Caribbean countries pursue these type of climate resilient pathways. If we do not make the right policy and investment decisions now, the impacts of climate change on our people, livelihoods, and physical assets will mount. This could lead to considerable human suffering and significantly reduce fiscal space and deteriorate private balance sheets across the region. In short, if we are not able to mitigate the impacts of a changing climate over the next 5 to 10 years, we may be even more ill-equipped to adapt to the increasingly severe and frequent climatic hazards. We cannot and will not allow our region to pursue this type of climate vulnerability pathway. This is among the reasons that we are gathered here today. CDB recognizes the urgency and scale with which we must act and is working diligently to provide more and better support to its borrowing member countries, the BMCs. The bank is committed to providing 25 to 30% of its own resources for climate finance by 2024, a significant increase compared to past years. CDB also recognizes the need to scale up flows of highly concessional climate finance to the region. The bank has therefore developed an ambitious pipeline of programs and projects to be co-financed by the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund and others, and is also strengthening its collaboration with other multilateral development banks and development partners to finance climate action in the region. The purpose of this seminar is to discuss the increased action and ambition needed at all levels from all stakeholders. All CDB member countries have an integral role to play in mobilizing climate finance and ensuring that it is channeled toward the most transformational initiatives. There are numerous policy and regulatory reforms and cost-effective actions, such as the application of building codes or standards and proper land use planning that BMCs must take to enable and incentivize climate action. Through the Paris Agreement, developed countries committed to scale up flows of concessional climate finance, as well as support technology transfer and capacity building efforts. It is expected that this support will be provided at a scale that is commensurate with the magnitude of the challenges faced by BMCs. With this in mind, I would like to share two thoughts that I hope will guide the discussions today. Firstly, I encourage everyone at this seminar to think about climate change as a collective challenge that requires a collaborative and coordinated response. Our region includes many different countries with distinct cultures, institutions, and peoples. Yet, the challenges we face from climate change are quite similar. We can learn a great deal from each other, support one another, and mount a response to this challenge that benefits all Caribbean countries. We are one Caribbean community. Just as we recently stepped up to support our friends and family in St. Vincent and the Grenadines after the eruption of La Soufrière, we must come together and ensure nobody is left behind in the fight against climate change, neither within our countries nor among the countries in our region. Secondly, we must all adopt a solutions-oriented mindset and apply this in our day-to-day work. For instance, we know that solving the issues related to scaling up climate finance flows and simplifying access to these funds will take time. But there are actions that we can take now to help put our countries on climate resilient pathways while we work in parallel to address more long-term barriers. Before closing, there's one final point I would like to stress. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown the scale and speed with which we can act when confronted with a crisis. Governments, businesses, and citizens across the world set aside preconceptions about what was and was not possible and did what was necessary to respond. COVID-19 demonstrated that we can act and try to make a difference at even the personal level. The same urgency should be given to climate change by each and every one. Climate change is no longer simply a problem, nor can we afford to address it incrementally over the coming decades. The poorest and most vulnerable are likely to be affected the most. This is truly a global and long-term crisis that warrants all hands on deck response right now. I would like to thank you all again for joining us today. I look forward to a very fruitful and solutions-oriented discussion. And with that, I turn over to our moderator, Dr. Colin Young, Executive Director, Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Dr. Young?
Distinguished participants and colleagues, let me first start by thanking the Caribbean Development Bank for organizing this important seminar as part of its Board of Governors meeting. I would also like to thank CDB's Vice President for Operations, Mr. Isaac Solomon, for his insightful and informative opening remarks. As the Executive Director of the 5 Cs, that is mandated by CARICOM heads of government to coordinate the region's response to climate change, I fully agree with the Vice President that climate change is likely the defining challenge of the 21st century. Our political leaders continue to make the point in every climate change dialogue that climate change is an existential crisis for us in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, the Caribbean is at the front line of the war on climate change, as was so eloquently expressed by Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit of Dominica in his UN address following the utter devastation caused by Hurricane Maria in 2017. We are at the front line because each year we experience the adverse impacts of climate change: floods, droughts, more powerful hurricanes, sea level rise, and increasing coastal erosion, to name a few. We also know that the challenges with which we are currently grappling pale in comparison to what is likely to come if we fail to meet the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. We know that climate-related hazards are not simply development challenges for our region. They constitute fundamental threats to our prospects for sustainable development. Climate change and COVID-19 share many similarities in that they are both physical shocks that are unleashing unprecedented and devastating impacts on our lives, livelihoods, and the economy of Caribbean countries. Both are testing and stressing, almost to a breaking point, the region's capacity to adequately and effectively respond. Both are exposing the many social and economic vulnerabilities that exist within our countries, and both are regressive in that they're having a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable amongst us. There are also important differences between the pandemics and climate change. Unlike the pandemic that can be curtailed or stopped eventually by vaccines, climate change has no inoculation jab. Instead, the risks are gradual, cumulative, and often distributed. These risks manifest themselves in degrees over time, leaving a trail of devastation and hardships. The accumulative risks posed by climate change will easily dwarf the trillions in economic impacts caused by COVID-19 over time. In my experience, decision makers in the region are acutely aware of the challenges we must confront and are eager to do so, but they all need help. Many Caribbean countries have made ambitious commitments in their nationally determined contributions. Some have already submitted revised and more ambitious NDCs in the lead up to COP26 this November. Despite the region's minuscule contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions, our member states have outlined ambitious efforts to do their part. Notwithstanding these commitments of our member states, we must also acknowledge that we have been less successful at scaling up actions on the ground, particularly the financing for adaptation and the building of our resilience. We must urgently address this imbalance if we are to improve our resilience to the escalating and worsening impacts of climate change. As mentioned by Vice President Solomon, this is a critical decade for climate action in the Caribbean. The decisions and investments that we make or fail to make over the next 10 years will have significant implications for where and how we live in 2020, 2040, 50, and beyond. We have but 10 years, ladies and gentlemen, for the world to act to keep the 1.5 degree temperature goal within reach. We have assembled a group of distinguished decision makers, leaders, and experts to provide their perspectives on how Caribbean countries can pursue these types of climate resilient pathways, as underscored by VPO Solomon. They will discuss, as we have heard, barriers and key solutions that may be pursued to scale up climate action post-COVID in the region. Today's events will include a brief presentation by Professor Michael Taylor from the University of the West Indies. Professor Taylor will set the scene for our discussion by sharing key insights and takeaways from the recently published The State of the Caribbean report. We will then move to the moderated panel discussion, during which we will hear from a panel of distinguished guests, including Senator the Honorable Simon Steele, Minister for Climate Resilience and Environment of Grenada, Ms. Maria Shaw Varagan, Director of the European Investment Bank, responsible for lending in Africa, the Caribbean and Pacific, Asia and Latin America, Senator the Honorable Cassini Lavelle, Minister of Public Works and Digital Economy of Dominica, Ambassador Fiona Clowder, the United Kingdom's COP26 Regional Ambassador for Latin America and the Caribbean. Following the moderated panel discussion, we will give the audience an opportunity to ask questions to our distinguished panelists. For audience members who would like to ask questions, please kindly submit them in the chat. We will do our best to ensure that we get to as many of these questions as possible, given our time constraints. At the conclusion of the Q&A, I will then invite CDB's Director of Projects, Mr. Daniel Bess, to deliver the closing remarks. With these words, I yield to the distinguished presenters and panelists. In a recent webinar, I heard Professor Taylor of the University of West Indies use a phrase that I hope will go viral as he urged us to climate action. He said, "We need to wise up, heads up, and wake up." Professor Taylor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Want to begin by just saying thank you very much for the invitation to speak the Caribbean Development Bank. It's an honor. Also consider it a little bit of a challenge to talk climate change in 10 minutes, especially climate change in the Caribbean. But let us give this a go. In truth, all I want to do is introduce and commend to all those watching a document called the State of the Caribbean Climate Report, and use this document as the basis for a quick context-setting talk, which really attempts to look at Caribbean climate science, 5 things we all should know. Caribbean climate science, 5 things we all should know. Let me quickly explain. The truth is that if we look over the last 4 years, climate has been sending a very clear message to us in the Caribbean region. So if we look on 2017 and we look on the fact that we had Irma, Maria, and Jose, 3 Category 5 storms that passed through the Caribbean within reach, we would have said, wow, that's unprecedented. But then 2019, if we look on Hurricane Dorian and how it sat unprecedented, in an unprecedented manner over the Caribbean, we would have said, wow. And then if we look on 2020 and the fact that we exhausted the alphabet of names, we said, wow, that was unprecedented. So climate has been sending some very clear messages to us. And if I'm just using the last 4 years to make the case, if I were to try to summarize those messages, I would summarize them as this. 1, climate is saying that, listen, it is rendering our development pillars unreliable. All those things that we are relying on for economic development, tourism, agriculture, fisheries, mining, the productive sector, they simply cannot deliver development in a consistent manner in the kind of climate regime that we are seeing. Climate is rendering our development pillars unreliable. But I would also suggest that it's sending the message that it is making our development goals unattainable. Those 2030 goals that we're all going for, clean water, zero hunger, good health, reduced inequalities, peace and justice. When climate in one fell swoop wipes out the economy of a nation, it is saying those goals will not be attained in the time frame you want them to be attained. Climate is making our development goals unattainable. And then thirdly, if those 2 are 2 messages, if climate is telling us, at least the climate we have seen, that accounting for climate is the only way to make our development agendas untouchable. Only if we account for climate can we make those development agendas untouchable by climate. But accounting for climate means we must have information. And in the Caribbean region, it means we must have information that at least has these 4 characteristics. It must be contextual about the Caribbean. It must be relevant about those development pillars and about those development goals. It must be at the scale of the Caribbean, especially the small island scale, and certainly it must be accessible. Well, let me introduce then the State of the Caribbean Climate Report, funded by the Caribbean Development Bank. It is a full report, just enough for your good bedtime reading. 11 chapters, 175 pages, 56 figures, 47 tables, 31 Caribbean climate authors, and produced by 3 Caribbean climate institutions. This report is many things. It's a review document. It's a review of authoritative works and recent studies on climate change, climate variability, and climate impacts about the Caribbean. That's the contextual, that's the relevant, that's the scale. But it's also a first stop document. It's a first reference point with respect to climate information for the Caribbean, geared at, in particular, but not exclusively for Caribbean decision makers. When you want the information, here is a first stop. That's the accessible. I am arguing that if we look on the climate science in this report, then at least 5 messages jump out at us that we all should know. Very quickly, let me tell you what those 5 messages are. Message number 1, no doubt, our climate is already changing. We must recognize it. So the truth is, this would come out of something like chapter 3 in this document, which looks on rainfall and temperature, because it looks on, first of all, setting what we call climatologies, or how the climate should be behaving, or how we are used to it behaving, because that's the starting point. But then it also looks on the trends of the last 50 to 100 years, depending on data availability and what's really happening to the climate. This is also picked up in chapter 4, which looks on sea level rise, droughts and floods and hurricanes, and chapter 6, which looks on climate extremes. And across these chapters, we find things like this. In recent times, we now have 23 more hot days and nights since more than we had in 1950. Where do those 23 hot days and nights go? Well, summer is starting earlier and lasting longer. We also have a more variable rainfall pattern. One year we have a lot of rain, the next year we don't. And the character of rain is changing. Longer dry spells, and then when it rains, it rains. 2 major region-wide droughts in the last decade and multi-year at that as well. Rising sea levels such that the recent rate of rise is at nearly double the long-term rate of rise. And put it together, the climate science of the Caribbean is suggesting that we have a new multi-hazard climate era that is here. It's all of these things, and it's unfamiliar. Climate message number 1 that we all should know from the climate science is, no doubt, our climate is already changing. We must recognize it. What's climate message number 2 from the climate science captured in this document? It's simply this: no return. Our climate will continue to change. We must prepare for it. That would be picked up in something like chapter 5, which looks at climate scenarios and projections. So it uses all of the latest science techniques done within the Caribbean, global models, regional models, statistical downscaling to get to the climate at a community level. It looks at all the multiple variables, the rainfall, the temperature, the sea level, all those I spoke to. But then we use these models to project what will the Caribbean look like in the near term, 2020s, in the midterm, 2050s, and at the end of the century. That chapter gives us other insights, such as, if it's a business as usual scenario, then by the end of the century, up to 98% of our days will be hot, where hot is measured by current standards. That's summer all year round. We'll still have variable rain, so one year will still be wet and the next dry, but we will vary about a lower mean, on average 40% drier across the Caribbean. We'll have more of the worst storms passing through the Caribbean, even if we don't have more storms. More droughts, that more of our time will be spent in drought, and up to 1 meter of sea level rise. The truth is, the climate science is saying there's an unrecognizable climate that is coming. And this unrecognizable climate will come even at 1.5 degrees, which we are going after. A clear second message from climate science that we all must know. No return. Our climate will continue to change. We must prepare for it. That third message that we all must know is this: no excuse. This isn't just a little weather thing that will come to pass. No excuse. Our climate is changing our lives. We must contend with it. So I would pick that up, for example, in chapter 7 of this document, this comprehensive review document, which looks on historical and projected impacts of climate change across 9 sectors and 5 cross-cutting themes. So it looks on climate change in tourism, freshwater resources, energy, biodiversity, education, health, finance and insurance, infrastructure and human settlements, poverty, security, gender, development, and social structure. And some interesting things emerge as we begin to see that climate is in all of these areas, such as Caribbean life is extremely sensitive to climate variations. It's across all areas. That sensitivity that we have is being transformed into a vulnerability. And there's an expansion of those who are most vulnerable. So an expansion of the pool of people who fall in the most vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, the farmers. And then, interestingly, and perhaps significantly, new climate vulnerable groupings are emerging. Those are the outdoor workers who we haven't given thought to yet. The athletes, the biodiversity, the heritage sites which can't withstand that unprecedented climate to come, and of course the future generation. The third message from climate science that we all must know: no excuse. Our climate is changing our life. We must contend with it. That fourth message is a simple one, and I think you have heard it in the preamble, in the introductory remarks that have already been given. No choice. Our climate demands change. We must tackle it. You would, for example, in this document find that in chapter 8, which says, if we have the information, how do we use it? So we look to the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, who are pioneering climate services throughout this region, so that we can act on climate change. Or the chapter 11, which gives a number of climate resources, including sea coral from the 5 seas. But it really is making the point that, listen, we have to pursue all options now and we have to do them now. We have to pursue mitigation, which is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And in the Caribbean, that must be on the table. It must be on the table with respect to our renewable energy, our forestry, our ocean, how we deal with waste, and certainly with our transportation. That's how we in the Caribbean pursue mitigation. It certainly is saying that we must pursue adaptation, and it must be across all those sectors and thematic areas I spoke about earlier. We must pursue education. Convinced and convicted people change how they act. And then we have to pursue collaboration. We're too small to do it on our own individually. We must do it together. Put together, that's our pathway to resilience. Message number 4 from the climate science that we all must know. No choice. Our climate demands change. We must tackle it. If I were to summarize what I've just said, listen, I've told you 4 messages that emerge from the climate science that is captured in this document. Message number 1, no doubt, our climate is already changing. We must recognize it. Message number 2, no return. Our climate will continue to change. We must prepare for it. Message number 3, no excuses. Our climate is changing our lives. We must contend with it. And message number 4, no choice. Our climate demands that we change. We must tackle it. But I'm not a climate scientist who doesn't know how to count. I said 5 Caribbean climate science messages we all should know. And the 5th message is really, if you forget all of these 4 messages, remember that one, because they all sum up to say, no regrets. Let's change the climate outlook for the Caribbean. And how will we do it? By accounting for it in the Caribbean. So when you look on the Caribbean climate science and use this document as your first point of reference for that climate science, whether you want to take the messages as we have to move from no doubt to no regrets, or whether you want to take the messages as we have to move from our climate is already changing to let's change the climate outlook in the Caribbean region, or whether you think of the messages as we must move from recognizing climate to accounting for climate, not just know that Caribbean climate science is sending simple, plain messages to us that we all should know. At least remember message number 5. No regrets. Let's have no regrets. Let's change the climate outlook for the Caribbean. Let's account for it. May I commend the document to you and encourage you, I hope I have, to at least take it up for your good bedtime reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Taylor, for those wonderful 5 messages that are coming from climate science. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the moderated panel discussion, and we will have a number of questions that we will ask our distinguished panelists to respond. And the first panelist that I have the honor to invite onto the floor would be the Honorable Cassini Lavelle. He is the Minister of Public Works and Digital Economy of Dominica. He has been in that role since December of 2019. He was previously President of the Dominica Association of Professional Engineers, and before entering government, he was Managing Director and Principal Engineer of the engineering firm Corisav Inc. He holds a Bachelor of Science and Master's degrees in Civil Engineering from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Senator, the Honorable Cassini Lavelle, your question that we'd like you to respond to is as follows. What are the main barriers that are inhibiting public sector investment in climate action in the Caribbean? And what are the 3 most important and transformational solutions that are needed at the national, regional, and international levels to overcome those barriers? Senator?
Thank you, Dr. Young. A warm Dominican greeting to all. Sakafet. I'm indeed grateful to be part of this high-level panel discussion on climate action. The reality of a post-COVID environment is one that we're all anxious about. It's a reality that we anxiously await because we have been living in fear and uncertainty since January of last year. But we must ask honestly, is there really a post-COVID reality? Are the scars of the world's greatest depression since the Great Depression aesthetic in nature, or are they deep, profound, and indelible? When I reminisce on the last 10 years of Dominica's history, I see a trend of more frequent and ferocious natural disasters. For too many times upon our shores, we are forced to see the ghosts of global environmental indiscretion. Effectively, we experience a major disaster every 2.5 years with major impact to GDP and HDI. Hurricane Maria losses alone amounted to over 200% of our GDP. But while these events claim their prominence in history, they always carve the muddled reality that we currently live. One where our government, through its policy, tries to nurture recovery while balancing this with fiscal sustainability. So our fiscal space has its limitations. In our case, we have a clear policy on climate action, that which has been formalized into our National Resilience Development Strategy. We went further to create a climate resilience and recovery plan to operationalize this strategy. According to our projections, the cost to achieve our climate resilience by 2030 is about EC $7 to $8 billion. Based on the assumption of steady government revenue and expenditure projections, a financing gap of approximately $2 to $3 billion was projected. And here we have it. In year one of the actualization of our plans, we have a pandemic. In my ministry, for example, we were allocated $71 million for fiscal year 2021 for investments in resilient public infrastructure. Approximately 45% of these resources could be accessed as government's priorities shifted to health security. Our smallness present particular challenges, such as quantum and length of time for return on investments of climate-related projects. Small island states such as Dominica have spent significant resources in adapting to the impacts of climate change by investing heavily in resilient infrastructure. Due to the size of the economy of our small islands, the return on these investments may take decades, which discourages governments in some cases to allocate resources towards these types of investments, especially when confronted with other urgent priorities or crises. All this while access to grants and concessionary financing is becoming even more difficult for investing in climate action. The stringent criteria and mechanism under which monies can be accessed may deter governments and agencies. Also, resources are not as available as before, as countries that are in the position to provide grants and the concessionary financing are now faced with issues of their own. So there's increased nationalism in some cases and greater focus on borrowing and investing for their own recovery. So it's important to have this conversation focused on transformational solutions to these challenges. We must refocus and redouble our efforts on environmental protection. That is, reduce the use of plastics, enhancing our coastal zone management, improve the management and maintenance of our ecosystem. The environment, if not managed, possibly can pose significant hazards and exacerbate risks and damage. Natural resources should be utilized as economic assets. The sustainable management and conservation of our natural resources will significantly reduce the impact of extreme weather events. Reduction in the cost of energy is important. In all parts of the world, the cost of energy is too high. We must exploit our natural resources such as geothermal or solar in view of reducing this cost. Energy efficiency and a dedicated strategy of integrating energy efficiency in all developmental agenda of each country must strongly be considered. Energy efficiency should not be viewed as an additional cost, but as a cost-saving mechanism. A reduction in energy costs places our economies on a platform to be competitive and spur economic development. Finally, human and technology capacity. Whereas some technologies in the developed world may be old and proven to our region, to some extent, the adoption and utilization may be new. Our education system has to catch up with the educational requirements that exploit and maximize modern technologies. Additionally, some necessary skills need to be developed. We must always lead in areas of research and development We must not wait patiently for summaries and conclusions of research and methods for which we were not specifically the test subject. We must improve and invest in research focused on our own unique endemic situation to better predict our environmental, social, and macroeconomic nuances and outlook. We must invest in and encourage our students to pursue STEM fields and sensitize them about their civic duties to contribute to our development. Finally, we must continue to respond to our challenges as a team, united as a Caribbean community. So I completely and wholly embrace this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for those key messages, including the need to redouble and refocus on looking at natural resource protection and conservation, reduction in cost of energy and increasing energy efficiency, improving investment in research, and having our students pursue careers in STEM, and of course, the call for collective response to our regional challenges. I would like now to open the floor to any other panelists who would like to respond to that question or have some insights about the contribution from Minister Lavelle.
Can I? How do we do this? Okay, I can just go. Okay. Then there's one point I thought the contribution was particularly pertinent in the sense that you were putting in context and were referring to what we, European Investment Bank, we consider the triangle between climate, development, and innovation. You were talking about qualification of the population and about students studying in the STEM areas, because this we find is essential. So innovation as the means to tackle climate change is going to be how humanity in the past has found a way forward and how we will find it again this time. So I thought that point was extremely relevant and I wanted to underline it.
I would like to, if possible, I think the scenario that my colleague and Dominique has outlined is typical for all of us as small island developing states, but it's to underscore the point about the financing gap, the $2 to $3 billion financing gap in terms of resilience building, and to stress the point that as small islands, we are with limited fiscal space, we are all showing extreme ambition. We heard the very structured plans that Dominique has in place. Grenada, exactly the same. We're demonstrating ambition. But one of the closing points that he made is this need for collaboration and for us as developing nations to work with the international community, where greater resources are available to assist, and the need for us to be able to have greater access, both at speed and at scale, to not just the financial resources, but the human and technical resources, the capacity building that's required for us to put those ambitious plans into effect.
Thank you for those comments, Minister Steele and Maria Shaw. We would like now to move to the Ambassador, Fiona Clowder. Ambassador Clowder was appointed as the UK's government regional ambassador for Latin America and the Caribbean on COP26 in March 2020. We can find out more about COP26 at the 2021 UN Climate Conference. Ambassador Clowder joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 2001 from the Research Councils to build and lead the FCO's Global Science and Innovation Network. In 2006, she went to India as Director of Corporate Services, returning to London in 2009 to work on migration issues. And from 2011, as Deputy Director of the Americas, Fiona led the FCO strategy on Latin America. She also served as Her Majesty's Ambassador to Chile from February 2014 to June 2018. And on return to work, she now is overseeing the preparations for COP26. Ambassador Fiona Clowder, your question that we would like you to respond to is as follows. What is the UK COP presidency's vision for COP26, and how is it supporting the Caribbean? And how can the multilateral banks help deliver this vision? You have the floor. Okay, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me, Maria, but you are muted. We're unable to hear you. And so what we will do is just move to another panelist, and we'll come back to you once you've sorted out the microphone. We will now go to Maria Shaw Varagan. She's the Director at the European Investment Bank that handles the lending operations for the ACP countries, Asia and Latin America. She joined the EIB in 1997 and has had a number of responsibilities, including as Head of Strategy Division of EIB until 2016. In this role, her aim was to maximize the impact of the EIB in a sustainable manner to deliver on the bank's mission to make a significant contribution to the future of Europe, its partners and its citizens by promoting economic and social cohesion in the EU and beyond. Maria, your question is, what are the prospects for scaling up access to concessional climate finance in the Caribbean in the next 2 to 5 years? Where and how can concessional climate finance be used in a catalytic way to mobilize or unlock investment at scale? You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking the Caribbean Development Bank for inviting the EIB to this panel. It's really an honor to be together with you. And I find that the keynote speeches that we have heard have raised some incredibly powerful points. And it is wonderful to have the opportunity to then explore and exchange in this context. As some of you may be aware, the European Investment Bank is the largest provider of climate finance in the world. And just to give you a sense of proportion, last year in 2020, we provided 26 billion euro of climate finance. And we have also, since the beginning of this year, become fully Paris aligned. This means that this institution is, as of the beginning of this year, all our activities are in compliance with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and are screened against these objectives to make sure that not only we are providing finance for climate projects, mitigation and adaptation, but where it is not for climate finance, that we are still within these parameters of a maximum of increase in the global temperature. So just to say that for the EIB, climate is in everything we do. But the EIB is not alone in this journey. There are many other international financial institutions that are increasing their lending ambition in the climate sphere. Clearly, the Caribbean Development Bank, and sometimes we're even doing it together, which is even better. But also the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and all the European Development Finance institutions. So all these partners are now aligning with similar objectives. And there are then specialized initiatives like the Green Climate Fund that has been established precisely for this purpose, so that it can provide concessionality alongside the finance of one or the other of the multilaterals. So the reality is that there is no choice, and we have heard it, that we should not regret this later. So we have no choice other than prioritizing climate action in all our finance. It is important for the population of today, but also for the generations of the future. So let me, therefore, when you ask what are the prospects of scaling up concessional climate finance in the Caribbean, I would say that these prospects are strong, and that what we need is climate finance that is powerful and at scale, and that it is well adapted to the needs of each one of the countries and of each one of the projects. And the EIB here, as well as other institutions, will be constantly looking out for sustainable projects where we can use our funding, but also our expertise. The opportunities are there, but let me touch on two key elements that I think are important when we're looking at concessional finance in particular. The first element is that for grants and concessional finance to be truly catalytic, to be transformational, we need to make sure that the governments are using it to structure in a strategic manner their approach with international partners. I must recognize that international partners, sometimes we are difficult. We come with very stringent requirements, and our due diligence requirements are very tough. But this has a reason, and it leads to an implementation of the projects that is tending to be much more successful. So what is important is that concessional funding is used for project preparation to help the ministries have well-prepared projects, and that we aggressively use experts to develop these projects and help throughout the project implementation as well. The projects have to be well prepared because we are all aware of the shortage of funds, and therefore that effort at the beginning, that investment in preparation is essential. And let me come to the second point, and it is that the projects need to be inclusive in their implementation. Well-prepared projects will need careful project management for a timely and efficient implementation. And in this implementation, it is essential that there is inclusiveness in the priorities. Let me be specific. The beneficiaries need to be included, and particularly those that are most vulnerable, those that may not have a voice otherwise. So we need to seek their opinions, make public consultations, include civil society in a way that we are taking their views into consideration. And in particular, with regard to climate change, let me mention the effect of climate on women, because women are often the most vulnerable and therefore those that would be suffering the most under climate change. So I'm going to conclude now, but I hope these ideas have helped to give some insights. But let me leave you with one final thought. Investing in climate resilience is like planting a tree. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now, and the same thing applies to climate resilience investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Shaw Varagan, and for highlighting those two key elements that you see are necessary for engagement with donors. One, the strategic engagements by governments, and two, the need for having very inclusive projects that reach and impact the lives of beneficiaries. I would also now like to open the floor to any panelists who might want to react to some of the comments from Maria or to the question that was asked. The floor is open.
I am certainly grateful for the insight by Ms. Varagan. I certainly want to highlight and reinforce the need for consultation as from the onset of project planning. It is really important to engage all stakeholders, because in terms of having a good project, a successful project, it is certainly important that we have that stakeholder satisfaction at the end of the project. One of the things, though, that I am concerned about or cognizant of is the time between projects are approved and when funding is disbursed. That has been a challenge for small island nations, and I know it's not just unique to Dominica. I know of a particular project, for example, the disaster occurred in 2011, and disbursement was much later. And in terms of executing the project, it was an infrastructure project. There was another disaster that followed, actually two. We had Erica and Hurricane Maria, and this certainly exacerbated and increased the scope of work. So these are some challenges that we are confronting here. So it is something that I want you all as financing partners, as development partners, to be cognizant of, and to be responsive to the needs as we have to adjust and maneuver our way in our fiscal space and our fiscal environment.
Thank you, Minister. Considering the time, we will move. I'm just checking Ambassador Fiona Clowder. Can you hear us? Okay. Here's a question we would like you to respond to, Ambassador. What is the UK COPS presidency vision for COP26? And how is it supporting the Caribbean? And how can the multilateral banks help deliver this vision? You have the floor, Ambassador. Unfortunately, we are not hearing you. I think then my apologies. We will proceed to ask the panelists the following questions. And for this question, we would like three panelists to respond. We would like Honorable Simon Steele to go first, followed by Ms. Maria Shaw Varagan, and if we can get the microphone working, Ambassador Fiona Clowder. So all three of you will respond to the same question. What are the main barriers that are inhibiting private sector investment in climate action in the Caribbean? And what are the most important and transformational solutions that are needed to overcome those barriers? And how might COP26 help address this? So earlier we spoke of public sector, and now we're addressing the private sector. Minister Steele, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So from a international perspective, in terms of getting international private investment here to the region, I think one of the barriers are ill-informed or poorly developed business cases that justify the investment specifically in adaptation. There are clear business cases on the mitigation side, certainly in the energy area, which is important to us. But when it comes to adaptation, whether that's infrastructure or other areas, these are less well developed. And I think it's critical to be able to attract the levels of private investment that is also that is potentially available, is to develop those business cases and demonstrate that there is a certainly a reasonable enough rate of return for investment. With regards to our domestic private sector, I think there has been a lack of engagement with our private sector. but that has started to change. Awareness of climate change, and Professor Taylor outlined some of the key points there. But the need for information, the need for us to be aware of the roles and responsibilities that we have. So lack of financial capacity is another one with our local private sector, and some of the investment challenges that poses. And then the final point I'll highlight is in terms of technical capacity to implement. So there is work that needs to be done in terms of engaging our private sector in terms of their responses to the climate crisis.
Thank you, Minister Steele. Maria?
I think I'll bring a different point of view. I would say that the main barriers for the private sector are three. The first one is the perception, it might not be real, but the perception of a further need for regulatory stability. So what the private sector is going to be seeking is a conducive business environment. And this is not only at the legislative level, but it's also in the implementing regulations and in the way these ones are applied. And then this point links to good governance. So that stability in the system is essential for the private sector to be attracted to one place or the other. Point number two is offtake certainty. So when building a business plan, this has just been mentioned, the viable business plans that the private sector is going to be looking for, they need to know who is going to be purchasing the services or goods that they're producing and what is the strength of those that are going to be purchasing. And the third point that I would mention is scale. And it is true that in the Caribbean region, the question of scale is particularly difficult because there are a number of small island states and the population per country is not that high. So here, what I would recommend is that sometimes a regional approach is what is going to be needed. And in that sense, that's why the Caribbean Development Bank is very valuable, because it has this regional approach and diversification when looking at projects. Because, and I'll finish with this, for the right projects, for projects that are well designed and well structured, finance is there. Finance is not an issue for the projects that are well prepared in the right regulatory environment and with a strong business case.
Thank you both to Minister Steele and Maria. Ambassador Fiona?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me at all?
Go ahead.
You can, fantastic. Okay, I don't know what we did, but it worked. So thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be joining you. A most interesting discussion. And I think starting with Professor Taylor's overview, and I look forward to hearing his report, I think all the things our speakers have been saying chime so closely with our vision for COP26. And so for the UK presidency, for COP26, what we're aware of is the need to bring the world together and the urgency of this agenda to address the devastating future impacts that climate change brings us, and also, as Minister Lavelle and others have clearly outlined, for the Caribbean, the very difficult situation already being faced because of climate change. And so under the UK presidency, we have 4 clear objectives for COP26. First of all, mitigation, to encourage all countries around the world to play their part in the transition to net zero through bringing forward ambitious, nationally determined contributions. And I know many in the Caribbean have already taken steps towards that. I encourage all those countries who are still preparing their NDCs to really focus on that with great urgency. Secondly, around adaptation. And nowhere is that more important than for the Caribbean. As Minister Lavelle and others have outlined, the need for adaptation and resilience is needed right now, and the need for those transformational solutions. To make all of this happen, finance is absolutely critical, and that is our third objective. And so that is about ensuring that both the donor countries meet their commitments to the $100 billion that was previously promised, but it's also about mobilizing all the financial institutions and the private sector. And that's where the Caribbean Development Bank and the other multilateral development banks have such a valuable role to play. And also for business, it's about seeing both the risks and the threats, but also the opportunities that lie ahead in finding those transformative solutions to help address and live with climate change. And so in all of this, international collaboration is absolutely paramount. We have to do this together. We cannot do it alone. The world needs to come together. And that is where the Caribbean has such an important voice in the future discussions on COP26. So I look forward to working with everyone in the region to try and make this vision a reality, and also to get the world to realize the urgency of this situation. Back to you, Dr. Young.
Thank you, Ambassador Fiona. And if I may go right back to you to ask your thoughts on what are the main barriers that are inhibiting private sector investment in climate action in the Caribbean. Do you have any thoughts to share?
Well, yes, thank you. So the private sector is absolutely crucial in both recovery from this terrible time that the world has faced in the pandemic, and which I know has had a huge impact on the economies in the Caribbean. But it's both about recovery and it's about climate action. But it's recognized that fiscal space is very limited. We're constrained by the business environment. The Caribbean has poor infrastructure, and the great issues I often hear from the Caribbean about access to finance, as well as the weak investment pipeline. And we need to do more to bring the private sector together with those opportunities in the Caribbean, to forge those relationships, to turn the vision of what's needed into a reality. And so COP26 will help with some of that by showcasing some of the global mobilization initiatives to aim at enhancing enabling environments, to generate pipelines of investment-ready projects, and to help create some of those financing structures to make all this happen. And so we encourage the region to strengthen the investment climate, to promote financial sector development, to develop that priority pipeline of climate projects, and to develop a stronger public-private dialogue. And so we're asking all the multilateral development banks to produce and publish their private climate finance mobilization action plans by COP26. Because it's really by governments, by banks, by the private sector working together that we will create that virtuous cycle of the policy vision, the regulatory and investment environment to make that happen, and the innovation and creativity from the private sector to turn that into a reality. Thank you, Dr. Young. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We will now proceed to ask Senator the Honorable Simon Steele to respond to his question. But just before that, let me briefly share a little bit of his bios. Senator the Honorable Simon Steele is a senior minister in the government of Grenada and currently holds the portfolio of Minister for Climate Resilience and the Environment. He previously served as Minister for Education and Human Resource Development, Minister of State with responsibility for Human Resource Development and the Environment, and as Parliamentary Secretary within the Ministry of Agriculture, Lands, Forestry and Fisheries. He's also a member of the Grenada's Upper House of Parliament, the Senate, where he currently serves as leader of government business. Minister Steele, your question is as follows. While concessional financing is undoubtedly important, good governance also has an important role to play in responding to climate change. What actions can government in the Caribbean countries take now to contribute to scaling up climate action? And what are some examples of our good practices for which decision makers should be aware and seek to replicate? You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Young. And I want to start by recognizing all of the previous speakers and to thank them for their insights and the context that they have provided. I also wish to recognize the presentation by Professor Taylor, which is a sobering reminder of the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And the report that he presents is an absolute must read for all of us, whether that's policymakers, senior executives, the general public. And again, it's always a pleasure to hear how Professor Taylor is able to simplify what to many is a very, very complex set of issues. But what this report tells us is that responding to climate change requires a whole of society approach. It is not something that governments can do on their own, nor is it something that governments can leave to the private sector to do themselves. We have to do it together, and that is a theme that's followed through all of these presentations in terms of the need for global collaboration. So in working together, there are three broad approaches that I believe we as governments and policymakers can take in order to achieve what we need to achieve. The first is that we as governments have to take the lead and create a policy and regulatory environment that will facilitate climate action. And that also speaks to the comment about Maria made with regards to private sector investment. We have to put in place national climate change policies that build our resilience to climate change impacts, whether that's building resilience to the disastrous Category 5 hurricanes that we're now experiencing with increasing frequency, or whether it's the health impacts that are placing an increased burden on our national health systems. In Grenada, for example, we have in place a national climate change policy that is being implemented through a national adaptation plan with several resilience building initiatives and a nationally determined contribution that is targeted at reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. These policies and regulatory frameworks, developed in a transparent and inclusive manner, incorporate input from all relevant stakeholders. This is important in order to achieve national ownership and participation in the implementation of these frameworks. The second approach is to put in place an incentive framework that will encourage all sectors in society to play their part. That incentive framework will have to encourage and reward resilience building incentives among the general population, whether through the adoption of appropriate building standards and practices or other such approaches. It will also have to provide rewards and benefits for investing in low emission technologies and reducing greenhouse gas emissions across our transport and energy sectors through a variety of methods that can include tax-related incentives, energy efficiency mandates, etc. Here in Grenada, we're piloting an incentive scheme through a project that we're implementing in collaboration with Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica. We look forward to the lessons learned and to bring it to scale on the basis of these results. The third area I want to speak to is the need for awareness raising among the general population to help them to understand climate change risks and vulnerabilities and how they can and should respond. This is critical to the success of the first two approaches mentioned. If the general public does not understand the risks and the options, they will not support the initiatives and participate in finding solutions. So in summary, we can contribute to scaling up climate action by putting in place an enabling environment that will encourage and incentivize climate action at every level in our society. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister Steele. And I would like to ask Minister Cassini-Lavelle for any reaction to those responses from Minister Steele. Minister, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. I think one of the things that resonates particularly well with me is the collaboration, the discussion with the private sector, and ensure that they're completely sensitized on the risks, the challenges, and the opportunities. Because I particularly am coming directly from the private sector. And when I think back on the event of Hurricane Maria, and in the government's attempts to rebuild, I remember certainly we actually added to a fleet of vehicles to assist the government with assessment of the tragedy, assessment of the event for various purposes, insurance, building back, and so on. And when you had the World Bank, other agencies, and so on in Dominica, the EU helping out, I mean, we as well, back then in my capacity as private sector, we actually needed to join the effort, join the fight, because I understood then clearly that we needed the government, the country, to actually find its way, find its feet to achieve our restoration and our rebuilding efforts. So it's important that private sector understands their role completely, and that is exactly how it's through collaboration that they're going to get on board and assist.
Thank you, Minister. I think it's very interesting how all of the responses seem to all coalesce around a very clear set of actions that need to be pursued both at the regional level and in terms of how do we scale up access to financing from the International Climate Fund architecture. At this point, I would like to ask questions coming from the chat, and this is open to anyone who may want to take it up. This first question is there anything that can be done by the Caribbean or wider global community that can slow the process of climate change?
Well, if I could just offer a very quick answer. In terms of our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, it is it's very small when relative to global emissions. So in terms of actions that we can take to mitigate, it's relatively limited. There are economic benefits in us exploring mitigation type solutions specifically in the energy sector, the economic benefits from developing those mitigation plans. But the focus for us, absolute focus and priority, is adaptation. As Professor Taylor said in his opening, even if we were to achieve the global target of a 1.5 degree rise in temperature, the extreme conditions, weather conditions, events that we are currently experiencing, we're going to continue to face those for generations to come. So our focus has to be on the adaptation component, notwithstanding our moral responsibility in terms of reducing emissions, but the economic incentives for us to explore renewable energies, etc.
Thank you for that, Minister Steele. And the other question I would like to pose, and maybe I can ask Maria to respond initially to this question. is that, is there an opportunity to utilize concessional financing to leverage private sector investment in climate adaptation and mitigation projects? How do we incentivize the private sector to invest?
I think the answer is clearly yes. So concessional financing can be used with the private sector. The way to do it is blending and de-risking. To the extent that the private sector is willing to carry out a project, but finds that there are elements of risk where a multilateral financial institution or an international financial institution can help, there we have a role. Because de-risking can sometimes be with a small amount of money what can lift the project off the ground. And then we are catalytic. So yes, concessional funding is not only for the public sector, it can also be with the private sector. We just need to make sure that we are respecting competition, that we are not affecting the free competition, but it can be done, it can be structured, and it can be extremely powerful to bring the projects to implementation.
Thank you, Ambassador. We do have a few more minutes. I would like to also pose a question and pick up on something that Minister Steele raised earlier when he indicated that generally when it comes to mitigation type projects, there's often a very clear business case. But when it comes to adaptation, it is primarily in the public good domain. And so the question is how do we take what are clearly very important public good adaptation projects and package it in such a way that it becomes bankable for the private sector? And maybe I can ask again both Ambassador Fiona, Maria to react to this, and of course we'd like to ask the ministers as well. Maria, you want to go first, or Ambassador?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll come in. Very good. Yeah. So on this, you know what I would say? It's not a choice anymore. Adaptation and incorporating climate risk management is needed in every project. Again, you know, it was, the professor has explained it very clearly. It is not whether there will have to be adaptation to climate change. Climate change is here and we need to adapt. So this analysis of what is the climate risks in every single project has to be done. It's not a choice. And within this, then what is the resilient solution that will be preparing the project, whatever the sector it is in, for that future with extreme weather conditions and with climate change that is here to stay. So I think it's really, right now, not an option. It is a must every single time.
Thank you. Any reactions to that, Minister Steele?
Just to say that there is work that's being done by the Global Commission on Adaptation, which is defining rates of return for adaptation initiatives. And I think this is a piece of work that needs to be broadly communicated, because what they have identified are rates of return ranging from $1 given a $4 return up to $1 to $10 return. But in order to be able to quantify those returns, there are these softer elements, obviously, that need to be brought into it. So I think there is a change of thinking that is needed, but there is clear evidence that it can present also an attractive business case, even within the narrow confines of a commercial discussion. So I think some of the work that they're doing, I think needs to be amplified and communicated with private entities to try and stimulate that interest. So information is critical.
Thanks for that, Minister Steele. We have time for one more question. And Minister Steele, you had raised in your comments the need for incentives to crowd in the private sector. And so I'd like to ask Minister Cassini to react to this question that was on YouTube. Would governments be willing to consider tax incentives or increasing the same for private sector investment in green projects?
Well, absolutely. I know that is something in Dominica that we are certainly open to. And while it has not been documented formally in terms of policy as yet, but it's something that we have done and we have been facilitating. And I'm certainly open to discussing with my colleagues, my parliamentary colleagues, to have this formalized as policy, because it is something that, in my view, that we must do if we are serious about achieving our resilience goals by 2030, for example. We must have all on board. We refer to the public sector, the private sector, and the consultation that Ms. Varagan spoke of, to have everybody included, all the stakeholders, because project satisfaction is and success is dependent on all stakeholders being satisfied. So when we have the challenges of the people in private sector who face many difficulties, like we do also in government, we have to look at means to assess the projects that align very well with our policy direction, and look at ways where we can incentivize these projects for sure, to ensure that they remain competitive, and that will also support our national agenda. So it's something, like I said, we're open to and we are doing, but it certainly needs to be formalized to ensure that we instill that required confidence in the private sector and to spur them on to continue investing.
And thank you for those thoughts, Minister Lavelle. Well, we have unfortunately come near the very end of our time for this very insightful webinar. And, it's very interesting that we've heard that we need the whole of society approach, whole of government approach. We need the projects to be at scale. We need them to be inclusive. And we need to look at how we can provide the kind of enabling environment to be able to crowd in private sector investment. I think Maria's call that financing for bankable projects is not a limiting factor. But at the same time, we also heard from the ministers that it has been absolutely difficult to be able to access climate financing at scale within the region. So clearly there's a lot of work to do. And hopefully the insights from this panel will help guide the CDB's efforts in trying to ensure that the actions and financing on the ground can flow to the countries that absolutely need it. And so at this stage, I would like to call on Daniel Best, the Director of Projects at the CDB, to deliver the closing remarks. Daniel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Colin. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have witnessed a very timely and insightful discussion on the Caribbean's development challenges in the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the continuous threats posed by climate change. This discussion underscored that our BMCs remain highly exposed and vulnerable to climate-related hazards, and that their economies are largely dependent on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, tourism, water, and transportation. Our borrowing member countries are located in one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world and have experienced frequent extreme weather events, including tropical storms, hurricanes, and floods. These events have often resulted in significant adverse environmental, social, and economic impacts. Recent devastations caused by Hurricanes Maria, Irma, and Dorian are certainly still very present in our memories. As the climate continues to change, we are likely to experience more frequent extreme weather events over the 21st century. Climate change projections point to increased intensity of hurricanes, intense rainfall, and prolonged droughts. For instance, climate models show that Category 4 and 5 hurricanes will likely increase in the Atlantic Ocean. Sea level rise can reach more than 1 meter by the year 2100, and the Caribbean will be a hotter and drier place as a result of global warming. In addition to the enormous challenges posed by climate change, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has caused negative economic growth in many BORI member countries in 2020. BMC governments are therefore facing multiple challenges that require them to continuously improve their economic, financial, and social resilience. This calls for the engagement of multiple stakeholders at local, national, regional, and international levels to help design and implement very ambitious actions. In today's discussions, representatives from the public sector and donor agencies have examined climate change adaptation needs in BMCs, some of the barriers that are currently inhibiting climate action, and some potential measures or solutions that can be pursued to overcome such barriers and build resilience to climate-related hazards. Allow me a few moments to reiterate some of the salient points that we have heard this morning. First, I want to thank the ambassador for sharing the COP26 vision. And the 4 points raised there would be: 1, the vision of a transition to net zero; 2, adaptation and resilience through transformational solutions, mobilizing adequate financing for these first 2 points; and 4th, international collaboration is critical and must underpin all of our efforts. From our panelists, we heard that the enabling environment must be favorable for private sector investment, and hence adequate national climate change policies and regulatory frameworks are needed. We need to incentivize our private sector for resilience building and investment in low emission development. We need an economy of scale, and that continues to be an issue for the Caribbean, and hence the need for a regional approach is critical. And stakeholder consultation and understanding of the issues is vitally important. We heard that the importance of closing the financing gap for resilience building must be at the heart of what we strive to do moving forward, and that the role that donor agencies and multilateral development banks can play in helping to deliver and scale up climate investment in the region is also vitally important. Climate risk management is therefore needed in every project. From Professor Taylor, we heard that given that climate is rendering our development pillars unreliable, and climate is making the development goals unachievable, accounting for climate is the only way to make our development agendas untouchable. And the 5 key messages which I think will stay with all of us is: first, 1, no doubt, our climate is already changing. We must recognize it. Second, no return. Our climate will continue to change. We must prepare for it. Thirdly, no excuses. Our climate is changing our lives. We must contend with it. Fourth, no choice. Our climate demands change. We must tackle it. And finally, no regrets. Let's change the climate outlook. We must account for it. I think you will all agree with me that the webinar has successfully engaged important players who brought different perspectives to help us better understand the climate change challenges for the region and adequately prepare for and respond to these challenges. I can assure you that the Caribbean Development Bank will not stop in engaging and working collaboratively with all key stakeholders to enhance climate resilience, reduce poverty, and transform lives in this region. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our moderator, Dr. Colin Young, the presenter, Professor Michael Taylor, our distinguished panelists, Senator the Honorable Cassini Laville, Senator the Honorable Simon Steele, Ambassador Fiona Clowder, and Director Maria Shaw Varagan. Thank you all for your excellent contributions to this webinar this morning. I would also like to thank our Vice President of Operations, Mr. Isaac Solomon, for his opening remarks and for giving us our marching orders this morning. Let me also thank our team members in the Environmental Sustainability Unit and other members and divisions of the bank who worked tirelessly to make this webinar a success. And finally, allow me on behalf of the President and management of the bank to thank you, our audience, for so graciously sharing some of your time with us this morning. We deeply appreciate your participation. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. Please stay well. Thank you.